Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 2 of 3 in this rookie face-off tournament for the San Jose Sharks between them and the Vegas Golden Knights. And as I predicted, this game ended up being significantly easier for the San Jose Sharks, unlike in the previous game against the Anaheim Ducks where they were thoroughly outplayed and ended up losing 8-4. Here tonight, they were the better team all around and defeated the Vegas Golden Knights rookies by a score of 5-2. Before we get into the players to talk about, should mention the goal scorers here. Jasper Weatherby scored the first goal of this game. Then it was Brandon Coe to make it 2-0. After that, the Golden Knights actually managed to get one back for themselves to make it 2-1. Anya Busha would score for the Sharks to make it 3-1. Then Scott Reedy 4-1. And finally, the Golden Knights would actually make it 4-2 after that, before Eklund would get an empty netter to make it 5-2 for the San Jose Sharks. And the first player to talk about, again, I'll actually go with Ryan Merkley. After the incredible performance he had in the previous game against the Anaheim Ducks, I wasn't necessarily expecting him to be able to replicate such a incredible, amazing performance, but I was still expecting him to be a driving force in this game against the Vegas Golden Knights, mostly because, competition against the Ducks was a lot harsher than this competition against the Golden Knights. There should have been, more open ice. There should have been more time in the offensive zone for the Sharks and for Ryan Merkley to work with, but instead, Ryan Merkley, unlike in the previous game where it felt as though almost every shift he was making an offensive difference, tonight it wasn't so much. The offensive differences coming from Ryan Merkley were very few and far between. And so while the defensive game was still okay, I guess, but that's mostly because the Golden Knights weren't necessarily able to put up a ton of pressure, it was definitely a step back from the previous game from Ryan Merkley. I wouldn't say that this is a hugely bad thing, but there were still times, I will say, during this game where Ryan Merkley could seem slightly disinterested, which has always been a criticism of Ryan Merkley in the past about his game. In particular, on this first Golden Knights goal, he maybe was a bit too nonchalant in trying to block that shot. Moving on to William Eklund, again, eyes on him. Was that first game just a small bump? Well, here tonight, even though, once again, I will mention that against the Golden Knights, you would expect these Sharks players to actually have more room to work with in the offensive zone, Eklund still didn't really manage to shine all that bright. He definitely looked a bit more comfortable than what he had in the first game, and he honestly did a lot of the little things right. And if there is something that I can mention about Eklund that is actually a very positive thing, is that he feels like he is definitely already a pretty well-rounded player at a very young age. When it comes to a lot of these younger players, they'll usually be able to have the offensive side of the game rather figured out, but it's usually the defensive side of the game that can leave a lot to be desired. But Eklund, while I wouldn't say his defense is superb, I would say it actually is up to par. It is actually a pretty decent level, and this is likely because he actually found himself in the Tier 1 Swedish league just last season, so he was playing against players who obviously know what to do, and Eklund has honed his game in that regard. So in terms of all-around play style and doing the little things correctly, Eklund is definitely there, but we haven't yet really seen that elite talent breakthrough. Just like in the previous game, there were a couple of moments, he had like a nice spinorama move once again in the offensive zone. He had this one particular shift where he kept the puck on his stick for an extended period of time, though it ended up leading to nothing, but it was still some solid puck control. But in the end, Eklund, it was a pretty good game, but maybe Sharks fans are still expecting a bit more from him. Next, I'll be talking about the Sharks goaltender, Benjamin Goudreau. Now, the first thing I do need to say, I've already mentioned this multiple times in this video, the Golden Knights were not as good as the Anaheim Ducks, and so it's kind of hard to, chastise Zachary Aymon yesterday or 2 days ago for his performance against the Anaheim Ducks and then praise Benjamin Goudreau so heavily for his performance against the Golden Knights, because obviously there was not the same caliber of shots and there was not the same volume of shots in tonight's game. But I will say that Goudreau did look actually rather secure in the net. He seemed like a pretty seasoned goaltender. If I didn't know he was a rookie, I would tell you he probably seemed like a player with at least a bit of NHL experience. I thought he made some really nice plays. He was very calm on some of the odd man rushes that the Vegas Golden Knights actually had. There was one particular shot that the Golden Knights took, I believe it ended up going wide, but it bounced off the backboard and came back into the crease, and Goudreau was very calm in being able to deal with this and keep it out of the back of the net, because, obviously that puck can really bounce around, hit off the back side of you, and just end up going in. So Goudreau being able to control that was definitely rather impressive, and so Goudreau definitely a very solid game here. It'll be interesting to see who actually gets the start in the upcoming game tomorrow, because there's actually less than 24 hours between this game and the next game against the Colorado Avalanche. So it's possible we see Goudreau again. It's also possible Emma comes in, and I would say maybe most likely is we actually see something like what the Ducks did in the previous game between the San Jose Sharks and the Ducks, in which the Ducks actually sort of played one goaltender for half the game and then the other goaltender for the other half. So we might actually see Emma get the first 30 or so minutes of that upcoming game against the Avalanche, and then Goudreau close it out. If I had to, if I was a betting man, but definitely Goudreau seemingly gets the better start in these first two games, even though Emma obviously had the deck stacked against him a bit compared to what Goudreau had. Next, I will be talking about Danil Gushin. He was a player who was obviously, lifted a bunch of heads when he played in the development camp game earlier a few weeks ago for the San Jose Sharks. He showed off a ton of offensive talent and obviously scored that incredible shootout goal in that game. And so here at the rookie tournament, from what I've seen, he definitely does have some pretty high level skill. He actually had a very nice assist on the Brandon Coe goal, found himself pretty much all alone in the neutral zone, and then made a very nice pass feeding it across to Coe, who was able to then put it in. So clearly Gushin has a certain level of skill. But remember when I was talking about William Eklund and I said, well, a lot of these younger players can have the offensive side of their game figured out, but maybe do not necessarily have that well-rounded style of game that Eklund does. Well, Gushin definitely fits in very well to that mold of player. The offensive game is there, but when it comes to a lot of the little things and some of the intangibles, there are some issues. Gushin was bullied off the puck a couple of times in this game. There were also a couple of issues defensively, you could say. So he's definitely a player who needs some more seasoning at the junior level. I believe will be in the OHL in this upcoming season, and hopefully he can really progress his game while he's there, because while the offensive game is still there, you do need those other things if you want to become a successful NHL player, especially when you are a player who is the size of what Gushin is. You're not like some overbearing 6 foot something type of player. When you're these smaller players, you need to be able to do those little things correctly. Next, I will be talking about Aussie Weisblat, a first-round pick from 2020 for the San Jose Sharks, the final first-round pick of that year's draft. And Weisblat, honestly, if I was going to compare him to a Sharks player currently on the roster, I would likely choose Rudolph Balcers. Weisblat, to me, seems like a player who is full of energy, definitely a quick player who can be crafty and skillful at, sort of his own level, I guess you could say. And to me, seems to have the ceiling of, could be a pretty good second-line player, if not just a really solid third-line player, just as Balcers has been in this past season for the San Jose Sharks. I'm not seeing the incredible elite talent out of Weisblat, but I would also say that while that ceiling isn't super high, he does seem to have a pretty decently high skill floor, right? I would be surprised if Weisblat doesn't make some sort of impact at the NHL level over these next couple of years. He's probably not going to be a first-line player, but he definitely has a lot of the tools to succeed at the NHL level, and it's exactly what we saw here tonight. There weren't some crazy plays. There wasn't anything being just perfectly orchestrated. He wasn't 10 steps ahead of everybody else on the ice, but he showed off some solid skills, and that gives me some hope for the future for Aussie Weisblat. And finally, to talk about a player who maybe goes a bit under the radar, that would be Brandon Coe. As I mentioned earlier on, he did score a goal here in this game, and I honestly thought he showed off some pretty good skill sets in this game. He is a bigger player, so as I mentioned with Gushin, when you are a smaller player, you have to pick up a lot more on the intangibles. When you're a bigger player, it's harder to get bullied off the puck, and we saw that from Brandon Coe. There were a couple of times where he was very tenacious in being able to get the puck back in the offensive and even in the defensive zone. So Coe, a 4th-round pick from 2020, could potentially be a pretty decent player for the San Jose Sharks. Should also be pointed out that when the Sharks development camp was going on, It was actually Brandon Coe who was given the opportunity to center Weisblat and William Eklund. So clearly the San Jose Sharks themselves see a pretty decent player from Brandon Coe, and maybe he can actually become something over these next couple of years. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks, as I said, will be back in action tomorrow against the Colorado Avalanche for the third and final game of this rookie faceoff. And I would suspect the competition will not be as high as it was in that first game against the Anaheim Ducks, but we should be in for a bit more of a competitive and exciting game than we had here tonight against the Golden Knights, because in the end, this game was, I would say, a bit slow. Class dismissed.